Thank you to all of you for joining us for what is really a very special occasion. For those of you that I haven't yet had the opportunity to meet, my name's Deborah Buzzard, and I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor of UBC and the principal of this wonderful campus. And I am absolutely delighted that you were all able to join us for the launch of a new book by a UBC author, Christine Lefaivre. Chris is a clinical assistant professor at UBC's Faculty of Medicine in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy. But more importantly, in my mind, she is a Kelowna resident. She is one of our own. She is a dear friend to me. And I would have to say that over the past 2 years, since I've moved here, she's been part of me discovering what fun it can be to live in the Okanagan and Kelowna. And those of you who are Chris's friends probably can begin to imagine what that might be like. We actually did pottery classes together last winter, so we're in deep here. When we were doing our pottery classes, Chris and I would chat a lot, and she was busy recovering from finishing the book. And she asked me if I would be kind enough to give it a read in what was a kind of a mid-level draft. And I think that was just before Christmas. And I took it home with me for Christmas, and I should tell you that my background is agriculture. And I have, no professional understanding or knowledge of traumatic brain injuries, fortunately. But I took this book home and was pretty determined that I would read it because she assured me that it was for a wide audience. And, I sat down with that book, and I couldn't stop myself from reading it. I couldn't put it down. And not only that, I was reading aloud to my husband, who is a chemist. And we both found it absolutely transformative in that it really opened my mind to what it might actually mean to have a traumatic brain injury. More importantly, what it might mean to be, in fact, a family member or the support system, or indeed the kind of professionals who are trying to navigate their way around helping an individual who suffered a traumatic brain injury. And I realized as I read this book that Chris has had a truly remarkable breakthrough in thinking about this in a holistic way. And as I read further, I really began to understand the complexity of, imagine navigating the complex world of lawyers and therapists and changing family relationships while suffering a traumatic brain injury. It doesn't bear thinking about. So to me, this book was a complete eye-opener. I know it will be a great text in many, many areas. I personally think it will probably become a standard for people who are required to work on the legal side of things as they try to understand how to help the professionals, the families, victims, etc. And I'm tremendously grateful for Chris actually, making me read a book about traumatic brain injuries over Christmas. It was a treat. And really, my husband and I did enjoy it a lot. So Chris's work is really, in fact, of great significance for us. The Lefaivre rainbow effect, I think, will become a standard for how we think about holistic treatment of brain injuries. And it fits with a project or a process that we are involved with here, which is creating a center around developing technologies to protect humans in hazardous environments. We call it Survive and Thrive Applied Research. And Chris's work fits in, if you like, at the unfortunate end where perhaps the protective technologies haven't worked. And we're delighted to see Chris as part of our STAR team. And in fact, there will be a public announcement of that initiative coming up in about 2 weeks' time. So those of you who are in Kelowna, watch out for a follow-on from this around what we're going to be doing with STAR. So I won't take too much time. There are a couple of other speakers to come up before we let Chris come to the podium. But I'd like to invite my colleague Gordon Binstead, who is a neuroscientist himself and happens to be both the Dean of our School of Health and Social Development and our Vice Principal Research here on this campus. So come on, Gordon.
Well, thank you so much. It's interesting. This book, as Deborah's mentioned, plays out on a few different pieces that really are my day-to-day life in the Okanagan. So, as Deborah mentioned, my background is neuroscience. Not acquired brain injury per se, but neuroscience in general. So having new and research-based approaches to understanding how the brain works, and in this case, understanding how the brain recovers from injury, are a really fantastic contribution to the broader literature, and in this case, to how that treatment can go on. So having, in my general view, any substantial contribution to understanding of the brain and understanding of recovery is a fantastic contribution. So in that, at that rudimentary level, it's a fantastic contribution. Beyond that, though, in my everyday life within the Faculty of Health, I'm reminded by my directors, who I see faces around the room, that understanding the basic functioning of the brain is all very fine and well, but really it comes down to the clinical application of how you go about doing it, and that there's the clinical work is as much art as it is science, and how you do it really has to be taught in an ordered way. So in that sense, this book brings it another level of saying, look, there is a formal approach and a great way that you can take towards best clinical practice, and this is a great example of that. As a dovetail to that, though, one of the conversations that we have around this campus very much these days is, what are the other skill sets that students at UBC really need to be having? And Chris and I have had this conversation a couple of times around really this need, regardless of your discipline, and neuroscience is a good example where you wouldn't naturally apply it, but regardless of your discipline, having understanding of basic business practice and how that applies to your field, in this case in the clinical context, is a third layer to this book that really makes it a fantastic contribution. So that's with my dean's hat on. Deborah brought up STAR, which I think is actually another fantastic piece to tie into this. So as Deborah said, STAR is the Survive and Thrive advanced research project that we'll be announcing in the next few weeks. But at the end of the day, the whole project is, how do you allow people to survive in and recover from environments they might not otherwise find themselves in? And when we talk about surviving is fine, but this book is all about thriving, right? And to make it out, to live through an injury is one thing, but to actually recover from that injury and get back to your way of life really is the important thing. So to have a great piece like this, where it ties in that thriving portion of what we're trying to get at with this new research endeavor, is really the icing on the cake of saying, if we're going to understand how the brain works, we need to understand how it works. Understanding how it works in pathology is fine, but understanding how it recovers from pathology and gets to recovery and gets to function really is the important piece that we need to understand. So that's my general comments. I'd like to invite David Marr to the podium, please. Sorry.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak at the Chris Lefaivre book launch, for I've been associated with Chris and her pioneering approach to the community rehabilitation of the brain-injured population since approximately 1987, and which she has identified as the rainbow effect. I was called to the bar in 1972 and have specialized in brain injury litigation since approximately the middle of the 1980s, or the last 30 years. Both brain injury litigation and brain injury rehabilitation were in their infant stages during the middle 80s and early 90s, and it was difficult, to say the least, to even find experts familiar with the problems of the brain-injured population within the community, let alone one that could actually deliver effective rehab to an individual. Enter Chris Lefaivre. Once I met and sat down with Chris in 1987, I wholeheartedly adopted her approach to brain injury community rehabilitation, which she identified for me as the rainbow effect. And I have applied, indeed insisted upon that approach in developing the claims of my brain-injured clients for the balance of my career. I understand that in the audience today there are several articling students, and I'm assuming that most, if not all of you, are interested in pursuing litigation as a career. Let me direct some commentary specifically to you. As articling students, you are at the commencement of your career. At law school, you've acquired the academic background for a successful career. Now, and for the next few years, you will acquire the necessary practical knowledge you need to combine with your academic background to ensure a successful career, which can easily be defined as obtaining the best results possible for your clients. In law school, I'm sure you were instructed that every successful litigation lawyer will at some point in the litigation interview all witnesses, and in fact, you're not being professional if you don't. Let me alter that concept just a bit. When you are acting for a brain-injured client, and once they leave the hospital, having received a diagnosis of a brain injury of whatever severity, it is your job to make sure that all family and friends are indeed interviewed. But, and contrary to what you were likely told in school, not by you. Because if you want to be successful, you will utilize the rainbow effect, and you will have an experienced OT, occupational therapist, interview the family and friends in order to establish a true and accurate pre-accident profile, because it is only when you have that profile that you can take the next two steps of the rainbow effect and determine precisely the nature and extent of the brain injury on that particular client, and then determine what will be the best rehabilitation approach. It is imperative for you to establish through an experienced OT familiar with the rainbow effect approach to rehabilitation that, as Chris states on page 1 of her text, we must be mindful that, like ourselves, persons with traumatic brain injury and their family are as different as blades of grass. The tapestry of their lives is based on how they think, their cultural influences, what they learn, how they are loved, and their unique family dynamics and life experiences. It is imperative to have a thorough understanding of the person's entire life pre-injury and how he or she derives self-worth, internally as well as externally. You as a lawyer do not have the professional expertise required to effectively establish the profile, and as, or more importantly, that profile is solid evidence that will be passed on to other members of the medical vocational team, neurologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, physiatrists, and vocational experts on an ongoing basis so that they can ultimately provide expert opinions relative to the effect of the brain injury on the real client, as opposed to the fictional client that is created when the true pre-accident profile is ignored. Insurance companies use investigators to identify this profile. If you use an experienced OT who applies the premises contained in the rainbow effect, you will win every time. I repeat, every time. I will conclude my remarks today by quoting from the end of my review for the rainbow effect located at the beginning of the text, where I said, I subsequently endorsed the rainbow effect in 1987 for all cases, no matter the severity of the brain injury, because this program will identify any and all residual functioning remaining to assist the brain-injured survivor in achieving the maximum quality of life possible and how best to achieve this objective. From a litigation point of view, there is no better way to prepare your evidence for trial and to follow the rainbow effect rehabilitation approach. Whether you are a survivor, a family member, a medical rehabilitation expert, or a lawyer, read this book. It was a game changer for me, and it will be for you too. It's now my pleasure to call Chris to the stage.
Well, firstly, I'm not a public speaker. We'll get that right off the plate. Deborah, I can't thank you enough for your support, your encouragement, your friendship, and your outstanding pottery skills. She was much better than I was. Gord, I'm just so looking forward to working with you in the future, and your Survive and Thrive program is going to make a mark. It's making a mark already, and I just know that it will be revolutionary. Dave, it's been a pleasure to work with you over the last several decades. Dave didn't mention that he's the founding party to the Kamloops Brain Injury Association, and he's still the president of that organization. And Dave has very selflessly given himself to the brain injured population, and you've just touched numerous lives. And so it's been a pleasure to work with you. So I have to say that writing a book has been a bit of an isolating experience, and so it's really nice to see people again. Thank you all for coming. I'm humbled to be in the company of so many who have devoted their careers to be in service to other people, and to our students who have ambitions to do the same. So I think that writing a book is a bit like gardening. There's a seed, but the seed can't grow without the sun, water, good soil, and fertilizer. I may have been the one plodding away on a computer, but there was an army of people working behind the scenes to bring it to fruition. Many of you. So how did this text come to be? As a child of 13, I suddenly found myself strapped into a striker frame in the Calgary Children's Hospital. You know, one of those sandwich contraptions that precludes any movement, flipping you over every 2 hours. It seemed impossible to me that only hours ago I had been in a gymnastics practice. After spinal surgery and then 6 weeks of immobility, I advanced to a body cast and then a body brace. An interesting note was not the offense of being in the striker frame, but rather that I have gone from a budding competitive gymnast, in my mind's eye, to a disabled kid in the eyes of my care providers. I suppose at face value I should have been able to understand I didn't look like much of an athlete hanging in midair, unable to move, but I recall feeling misunderstood and devalued. I recognized that my experience of pre-injury identity was shared with many of the other patients, most worse off than I was. So fast forward to 1979. As a newly graduated occupational therapist, I was supervising mental health boarding home programs. With advances in emergency medicine, airbags, seatbelt laws, more and more people were surviving catastrophic incidents and in fact were being discharged from hospital. With no designated brain injury programs, they were transferred to the mental health system. I was excited to work with early brain injured survivors who were placed in the mental health boarding home programs. A young brain injured client who shared many of the same passions as I did, including gymnastics, was admitted to our group home with a severe brain injury, and she was living with schizophrenic roommates. In a wheelchair, aphasic, unable to speak, she would kick people as they walked by in an effort to be heard. Watching this young lady's struggle caused me to revisit those old 13-year-old feelings of being devalued and misunderstood. I was quite certain that she didn't see herself as she presented, but rather as she was before this life-altering injury. Another unusual note was that she began to mimic schizophrenic behavior. I reasoned that if a client with a traumatic brain injury could learn what they were being exposed to, then it appeared that learning was indeed taking place. I surmised, shouldn't they be at home where things are familiar and they can relearn what they used to do? Well, with the energy that only youth avails, I was a woman on a mission to advocate and secure funding for brain-injured clients in my group homes to return home with support and supervision. The results were astounding. I began to document which scenarios were successful and which were more challenging. Sensory overload in many variations was frequently the culprit when there were suboptimal outcomes. If I could better understand how the brain was processing information up to the point of sensory overload, then I could rewind the events so in the future these hotspots could be avoided. After years of careful observation, I developed a theory and a method. 3 key points differentiate this model from others. Number 1, the community treatment does not commence at the point of injury, but rather at the point of gaining a clear understanding of the client's life before the injury, thus availing the template of familiar activity that the community therapy will be based on. Number 2, stress symptoms and brain injury symptoms can appear the same, but with different causation. The rainbow effect holds the key to separate out these interrelated symptoms so the clinical team can address the brain injury once the stress is managed. Number 3, I also witnessed that returning brain-injured persons home came at a huge cost to families, often resulting in health breakdown and relationship breakdown, health problems and relationship breakdown. My theory of the traumatically induced dysfunctional family positions the healthcare team to successfully support and protect the family unit. My first goal is that this text will contribute to offer more specialized training to any student who will eventually work with brain-injured survivors. There's an instructor's PowerPoint presentation and family handouts available for download as well. The statistics are astounding. Traumatic brain injury, according to the World Health Organization, will surpass many diseases as the major cause of death and disability by the year 2020. Within industrialized countries, the number of productive years lost because of traumatic brain injury exceed those of cancer, cerebral vascular disorders, and HIV/AIDS combined. Mild to moderate brain injury does not necessarily show up on radiological imaging. If we miss the diagnosis, the burden can be felt in other sectors of society. A staggering 82% of prison inmates and 53% of homeless persons live with the effects of a traumatic brain injury. TBI has been identified as the signature injury of the Iraq-Afghanistan conflict. An estimated 20% of our returning veterans have sustained a traumatic brain injury. To further compound the problem, it's been estimated that after one brain injury, the risk of a second triples, and after the second brain injury, the risk of a third is 8 times greater. Worldwide research sounds a rallying call that universal standards of care and protocols need to be established. My second goal is that I would like this text to contribute to this global discussion. And lastly, the predominant theme is that there is hope post-brain injury. To those clients with whom I've had the privilege to walk with through the journey of recovery, you are the inspiration for this book, and you deserve our deepest respect. Thank you.